It was a late summer evening, the kind where the air still held a hint of warmth, even as the sun dipped below the horizon. My wife, Emily, had invited her family over for a casual get-together, a small celebration of her promotion at work. Her parents were in the kitchen, chatting and preparing food, while her younger sister, Hannah, stood by the back door, sipping from a glass of wine as she watched the fading light over the yard. I leaned against the counter, watching the scene unfold in front of me. It was a peaceful evening, one of those moments where everything felt perfectly normal. But something about it felt different too, like the air itself was charged with an invisible energy, one I couldn't quite place. Hannah caught my eye and smiled. There was something playful in her expression, a glint in her eyes that had always been there, but tonight, it felt more pronounced. I smiled back, trying to ignore the way my heart seemed to skip a beat at the sight of her. Hannah had always been the more free-spirited of the two sisters. Where Emily was practical, focused, and organized, Hannah was spontaneous, with an air of carefree confidence that made people gravitate toward her. She was younger by a few years, still figuring out her career and life, but she had an ease about her that always drew attention. As I stood there, Emily came up beside me, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Everyone looks happy, don't they?" she said, her voice warm. "Yeah," I replied, glancing down at her. "It's a nice night." "I'm glad you're here," Emily said, smiling up at me. "You're always so great with my family." I leaned down to kiss her cheek, and as I did, I caught another glance at Hannah, who had now turned her back to the house, staring out at the yard. Something about the way she stood there, the curve of her neck illuminated by the golden light, made my breath catch in my throat. I quickly looked away, trying to shake the thoughts that had begun to creep into my mind. Emily excused herself to join her parents in the kitchen, leaving me alone with my wandering thoughts. I poured myself another drink, trying to focus on the evening ahead, but my attention kept drifting back to Hannah, standing just outside the door. It was nothing, just my imagination running wild, I told myself. She was my wife's sister, and I was happily married. Whatever strange tension I was feeling was just a product of my own overactive mind. But as the night wore on, that tension only seemed to grow. Every time I caught a glimpse of Hannah, whether it was a passing glance or the briefest touch of her hand as she passed me a drink, I felt that same electric pull. It wasn't anything overt. If someone had been watching us, they wouldn't have noticed a thing. But between us, in the small shared moments, something unspoken was building. Later, after dinner, I stepped outside to get some air. The night had grown cooler, the sounds of crickets filling the silence as I leaned against the deck railing. I closed my eyes, trying to clear my head, but when I opened them, Hannah was standing beside me, her glass of wine in hand. "Needed a break too?" she asked, her voice light but laced with something more. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just getting some air." She smiled, a small, knowing smile that made my chest tighten. "It's a nice night." We stood there in silence for a moment, the only sound the faint hum of the conversation inside the house. The tension between us was palpable now, though I wasn't sure if it was real or just in my head. I glanced over at her, taking in the way the moonlight cast a soft glow on her face, and for a brief second, I allowed myself to wonder what it would feel like to reach out, to touch her, to close the small gap between us. But then I shook the thought away, turning my gaze back to the yard. This was wrong. Hannah was Emily's sister. I couldn't let my mind go there, no matter how strong the pull between us felt. Hannah took a sip of her wine, then turned to face me, her eyes locking onto mine. "You've been quiet tonight," she said, her voice low. I swallowed hard, not sure how to respond. "Just tired, I guess." She didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there, studying me. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she set her glass down on the railing and took a step closer. "You sure that's all it is?" Her question hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I could feel the blood rushing to my ears, my heart pounding in my chest as she moved even closer, her body now just inches from mine. I could smell the faint scent of her perfume, could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, and it took everything in me to stay rooted to the spot, to not give in to the overwhelming urge to close the distance between us. I started to say something, anything that would diffuse the situation, but before I could finish, Hannah reached out and gently touched my arm. The contact was light, barely more than a brush of her fingers, but it sent a shock of electricity through me. I froze, my mind racing as I looked down at her hand, then back up at her face. There was something in her eyes now, something I hadn't seen before. It wasn't just playfulness, it was desire. "I've been thinking about you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My head spun, my mind trying to make sense of what was happening, but before I could process it, Hannah stepped even closer, her body now pressed against mine. "I know it's wrong," she continued, her lips dangerously close to my ear. "But I can't stop thinking about you." My breath hitched in my throat, and I knew I should pull away, that I should stop this before it went any further. But I couldn't. I was frozen in place, caught between the overwhelming guilt and the undeniable pull of the moment. "Hannah," I whispered, my voice trembling. But she didn't let me finish. Before I could say another word, she reached up, her hand gently cupping the back of my neck, and pulled me down into a kiss. It was soft at first, hesitant, as though she was testing the waters, waiting to see if I would pull away. But when I didn't, when I kissed her back, the kiss deepened, and all the tension that had been building between us exploded in a flood of emotion. I knew it was wrong, that I was crossing a line that couldn't be undone, but in that moment, I couldn't stop myself. I couldn't stop the way her touch made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. Hannah's lips moved against mine with an urgency that made my head spin. My mind screamed at me to stop, to push her away, but my body wasn't listening. Instead, I found myself pulling her closer, my hands gripping her waist as the kiss deepened. The heat between us was undeniable, an intensity that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long, finally breaking free. I couldn't believe what was happening. This was Hannah, my wife's sister. I had crossed a line, one that I knew I could never come back from. But in that moment, as her hands slid up my arms, pulling me deeper into the kiss, I couldn't seem to care about the consequences. The world outside faded away. There was only her warmth, the softness of her lips, the way her body fit so perfectly against mine. I didn't want to think about what this meant, about the guilt that would inevitably come crashing down. Right now, in this moment, all that mattered was the way she made me feel, the way her touch sent shivers down my spine. Hannah broke the kiss first, pulling back just enough to look up at me, her eyes dark with desire. Her breathing was ragged, her chest rising and falling as she tried to steady herself. "I know this is wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I can't stop." I stared at her, my heart racing in my chest. I knew I should say something, anything that would bring us back to reality, but the words wouldn't come. All I could think about was how badly I wanted to kiss her again, to lose myself in the way she made me feel. "Hannah," I began, but before I could finish, she grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the house. My heart pounded in my ears as I followed her inside, the noise from the party in the kitchen muffled by the sound of my own thoughts. She led me through the hallway, her grip firm but trembling, and before I knew what was happening, she pulled me into the small, dark closet off the side of the hallway. The door closed behind us with a soft click, and we were plunged into darkness. "Hannah," "We shouldn't," I tried to say, but she silenced me with a kiss, more urgent this time, more desperate. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. The small space of the closet felt suffocating, but at the same time, it only heightened the intensity of what was happening between us. Her hands were on me, sliding up my chest, tugging at the fabric of my shirt as if she couldn't stand the distance between us any longer. I responded in kind, my hands finding her waist, pulling her closer, needing to feel her against me. Her breath was hot against my skin as she whispered in my ear, "I've wanted this for so long." Her words sent a jolt of electricity through me, and suddenly, all the guilt I had been trying to push away came rushing back. What was I doing? This wasn't just a kiss. It was a betrayal, one that would destroy everything if anyone ever found out. I had to stop this before it went any further. But then her lips found my neck, her fingers threading through my hair, and all rational thought dissolved. I kissed her again, harder this time, my hands roaming over her body as the heat between us built to an unbearable level. I couldn't stop. I didn't want to. In the darkness of the closet, the world outside ceased to exist. There were no consequences, no guilt, just her and the overwhelming desire that consumed us both. The space was so small, so confined, and it only made the tension between us more palpable. I could feel every breath she took, every tremor that ran through her body as we gave in to the pull we had been fighting for so long. But then, as quickly as it had started, the reality of the situation came crashing back in. I pulled away, breathless, my heart hammering in my chest as the weight of what we were doing hit me like a ton of bricks. "Hannah, we can't do this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is wrong. We can't." She stared at me in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the closet door, her eyes wide with a mixture of desire and guilt. "I know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I don't want to stop." Her words hung in the air between us, heavy with everything we weren't saying. I could feel the pull between us, the undeniable attraction that had been building for weeks, maybe even months. But I couldn't let this happen. Not here. Not like this. "We have to stop," I said, forcing myself to take a step back, creating a small space between us. "This isn't right. You're Emily's sister." Hannah's eyes filled with unshed tears, and for a moment, I thought she might break down. But then she took a deep breath and nodded, her voice barely audible as she whispered, "I know. I'm sorry." The weight of her apology hit me hard, and suddenly, all the guilt I had been trying to push away came rushing back. I had kissed her. I had let it go too far. This wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment. This was something that could ruin everything if it ever came to light. "I'm sorry too," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I didn't mean for this to happen." Hannah wiped away a tear, her expression conflicted. "I don't know what's wrong with me," she whispered. I've been feeling this for so long, and I didn't know how to stop." I swallowed hard, my throat tight with the weight of everything that had just happened. "We can't let this go any further," I said, trying to sound firm, even though my heart ached at the thought of pulling away from her. "We have to stop." Hannah nodded again, but there was a sadness in her eyes that made my chest tighten. "You're right," she whispered. "We have to stop." For a moment, we stood there in the darkness, the silence between us filled with everything we weren't saying. I could feel the tension still lingering in the air, the unspoken desire that neither of us knew how to fully let go of. But I knew we couldn't keep going down this path. It would destroy everything. Finally, I took a step toward the door, my hand resting on the knob. "I'll go first," I said quietly. "Give it a minute before you come out." Hannah nodded, her eyes downcast, and I could see the guilt etched across her face. I wanted to say something to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay, but I didn't know if that was true. So instead, I just opened the door and slipped out of the closet, my heart heavy with the weight of what had just happened. As I walked down the hallway, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, desire, confusion. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know how to face Emily, how to pretend that everything was fine when I had just kissed her sister. I couldn't believe what had happened. But even as the guilt weighed down on me, I couldn't stop thinking about the way Hannah had looked at me, the way her touch had made me feel. I couldn't stop thinking about her. As I walked down the hallway, my heart pounded in my chest, my mind still racing with the events that had unfolded in the closet. Every step felt heavier than the last, and with each one, the weight of guilt pressed down on me harder. I couldn't shake the image of Hannah's face, the sadness in her eyes, the desire, the vulnerability that had pulled me in despite every warning bell going off in my head. I slipped back into the living room, where the noise of the gathering continued as if nothing had happened. Emily was in the kitchen with her parents, laughing over something trivial, her voice carrying a lightness that made my stomach turn. She had no idea what had just taken place between her sister and me, and the thought of betraying her like that was too much to bear. I stood there for a moment, my hands trembling, trying to figure out how to act normal. How to pretend that I wasn't falling apart inside. "Hey, there you are," Emily called out, smiling when she saw me. "You okay? You've been gone for a while." I swallowed hard and nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just needed some air." She walked over and kissed me on the cheek, her warmth both a comfort and a reminder of what I had just done. "Glad you're back," she said, her voice filled with affection. I tried to return the gesture, but my heart wasn't in it. All I could think about was how I had betrayed her, how I had crossed a line that I could never uncross. My mind raced, and I couldn't focus on anything but the overwhelming sense of guilt that clung to me like a weight I couldn't shake. Hannah still hadn't come out of the closet. I knew I had to avoid looking toward the hallway, knowing that when she eventually returned, things would never feel the same between us. We had shared something deeply intimate, something we both knew was wrong, but it had happened, and now we were left to grapple with the consequences. For the rest of the night, I tried to stay close to Emily, hoping that being near her would somehow ease the guilt I was feeling. But it didn't. Every time I looked at her, all I could think about was how I had betrayed her trust, how I had allowed myself to fall into a situation I should have avoided from the beginning. The evening dragged on, and eventually, people began to leave. Hannah slipped back into the room at some point, though she avoided my gaze completely, keeping her distance as much as possible. The tension between us was thick, though no one else seemed to notice. If Emily's parents suspected anything, they didn't let on, and for that, I was thankful. But the silence between Hannah and me was deafening. I could feel her presence, even when she was across the room, and every time I caught a glimpse of her out of the corner of my eye, the memory of what had happened in the closet came rushing back, raw and unrelenting. Finally, when the house was quiet and Emily's parents had left, I felt like I could breathe again. But the relief was short-lived. As I stood by the front door, saying goodbye to the last guest, I felt a presence behind me. I turned, and there she was, Hannah, standing in the dim light of the hallway, her eyes locked on mine. I froze. We didn't say anything, but in that moment, everything we had left unspoken seemed to pass between us. The guilt, the desire, the confusion, it was all there, hanging in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. But before either of us could say a word, Emily came up behind me, wrapping her arms around my waist and resting her head on my shoulder. "Ready to call it a night?" she asked, her voice soft. I looked at her, my heart breaking under the weight of what I had done. "Yeah," I managed to say, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Hannah's gaze lingered for a moment longer, her expression unreadable, before she turned and walked away, disappearing down the hallway. I watched her go, feeling a hollow ache in my chest that I couldn't explain, and then I turned back to Emily, trying to focus on her, on the life we had built together. But it was no use. The guilt had already sunk in too deep. That night, as I lay in bed beside Emily, her soft breathing lulling her into sleep, I stared up at the ceiling, my mind racing. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened in the closet, about the way Hannah had looked at me, about the intensity of the moment we had shared. It felt like a dream, something that couldn't possibly be real, but the guilt gnawing at my insides reminded me that it was all too real. I turned over, careful not to wake Emily, and buried my face in my hands. I didn't know what to do. How could I move forward from this? How could I look at Emily every day, knowing that I had betrayed her in the worst way possible? And what about Hannah? How would we face each other after what had happened? There were no easy answers. All I knew was that things could never go back to the way they were. The next morning, I tried to shake off the weight of the night before, but it clung to me like a shadow. Emily was cheerful, oblivious to the turmoil brewing inside me, and I did my best to keep up appearances, pretending that everything was fine. But the guilt was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to bubble over. Hannah left early, making an excuse about needing to meet a friend for lunch, and while I was relieved not to have to face her, a part of me ached at her departure. I didn't understand why. After everything that had happened, I should have been glad to see her go, to put distance between us. But I couldn't deny that something had shifted, that the connection between us had been more than just a fleeting moment of passion. It scared me. Over the next few days, I tried to throw myself into work, hoping that keeping busy would help me forget about what had happened. But it didn't. Every time my phone buzzed with a message or email, I half expected it to be from Hannah, though she didn't contact me. And every time Emily smiled at me, I felt like the worst person in the world for what I had done. I was caught in a web of guilt and desire, and no matter how hard I tried to escape, I couldn't find a way out. One evening, about a week after the party, I was sitting on the couch, flipping mindlessly through the channels on TV, when my phone buzzed. My heart skipped a beat as I glanced down at the screen. It was a message from Hannah. "I need to talk to you." My stomach churned as I stared at the message, my mind racing with possibilities. What could she possibly want to talk about? Did she regret what had happened as much as I did? Or was this something else entirely? I hesitated for a moment before typing out a response. "When?" "Tonight. Meet me at the coffee shop near your office. 8 p.m. I glanced at the clock. It was already 7:30. My heart pounded in my chest as I quickly made up an excuse to Emily about needing to finish some work and slipped out the door. The drive to the coffee shop felt like a blur, my thoughts racing the entire way. When I arrived, Hannah was already there, sitting at a table in the back, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. She looked up as I approached, her expression unreadable. "Thanks for meeting me," she said quietly as I sat down across from her. I nodded, unsure of what to say. The air between us was thick with unspoken tension, and I could feel my pulse quicken as I waited for her to speak. "I've been thinking about what happened," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "And I don't know what to do." I sat there, my mind spinning as I looked across the table at Hannah. Her words hung in the air between us, thick with the weight of everything that had happened. I didn't know what to say, and from the way she fidgeted with her cup, it was clear she was just as lost as I was. "I've been thinking about it too," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. The coffee shop seemed suddenly too small, too intimate, and the reality of what we had done weighed heavier with every passing second. Hannah looked up, her eyes filled with confusion and regret. "I can't stop thinking about it," she admitted, her voice trembling. "It's been eating me up inside, and I don't know how to make it go away." I swallowed hard, guilt pressing down on me like a heavy weight. "Neither do I confessed, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know how we got here, Hannah. But it can't continue." Hannah's eyes filled with unshed tears, and she nodded, her lips trembling as she struggled to keep her composure. "I know," she whispered, "but that doesn't make it any easier." The silence between us stretched out, heavy with unspoken feelings. I could feel the pull between us still, even now, but I knew that giving in again would only make things worse. We had crossed a line, one that we couldn't undo, but we had to stop before we caused even more damage. "We have to move on," I said softly, though the words felt like they were tearing me apart as I spoke them. "We have to let this go." Hannah wiped away a tear that had slipped down her cheek and nodded. "You're right," she whispered. "But I don't know how to forget about it." I didn't know how to answer her. The truth was, I didn't know how to forget either. The memory of our kiss, of the intensity of that moment in the closet, still burned in my mind, and I knew it would be impossible to erase. But we had no other choice. If Emily ever found out, if anyone ever knew, everything would fall apart. The guilt alone was enough to suffocate me, but the thought of hurting Emily, of destroying the life we had built together, was unbearable. "We have to," I said, my voice firmer this time. "For both of us." "For Emily." Hannah nodded again, her eyes downcast, and for a moment, I thought she might break down. But she held herself together, taking a deep breath before looking back up at me. "I'll try," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll try to move on." I wanted to offer her some kind of comfort, to tell her that everything would be okay, but I couldn't. Nothing about this situation was okay, and I didn't know if it ever would be. The best we could do now was walk away and try to pick up the pieces. We sat in silence for a few moments longer, both of us lost in our own thoughts, before I finally stood up. "I should go," I said, my voice heavy with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. Hannah nodded, standing up as well. "Yeah," she whispered. "Me too." I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to say goodbye. This felt like the end of something, but I didn't know how to close this chapter without it feeling like a permanent scar. "Take care, okay?" I said softly, my heart aching at the sadness in her eyes. She smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You too," she whispered. And with that, I turned and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving her behind. The drive home felt like a blur, my mind clouded with guilt and confusion. How had we let things get so far? How had I let myself betray Emily like that? When I got home, Emily was waiting for me, sitting on the couch with a glass of wine in her hand. She smiled when she saw me, and my heart broke a little more. She had no idea, no inkling of the storm that had been brewing just beneath the surface of our lives. "Hey," she said, her voice warm. "Everything okay?" I forced a smile, nodding as I sat down beside her. "Yeah, I lied. Everything's fine." But everything was far from fine. The guilt gnawed at me, a constant reminder of the line I had crossed, of the betrayal I had committed. I didn't know how to move forward, how to pretend that everything was normal when nothing felt normal anymore. Days turned into weeks, and gradually, the raw intensity of what had happened with Hannah began to dull. We didn't speak again, not about what had happened in the closet or about the conversation in the coffee shop. We kept our distance, and over time, the tension between us seemed to fade, though the memory of that night lingered in the back of my mind like a quiet ache. But as the weeks passed, the guilt remained. I loved Emily, and every time I looked at her, I felt the weight of my betrayal pressing down on me, suffocating me. I didn't know how to make it right, didn't know how to undo the damage I had done, even if she never found out. One evening, months later, Emily and I were sitting together on the porch, watching the sunset. She rested her head on my shoulder, her fingers laced with mine, and I felt a deep pang of regret for everything I had put at risk. "I love you," she whispered, her voice soft and full of warmth. I swallowed hard, my throat tight as I struggled to keep my emotions in check. "I love you too," I whispered back, my voice thick with the weight of everything I couldn't say. And in that moment, I knew that the guilt would never truly go away. It would always be there, a quiet reminder of the mistake I had made, of the line I had crossed. But I also knew that I had to try to move forward, to be the husband that Emily deserved, even if it meant carrying the weight of that guilt for the rest of my life. Hannah and I had crossed a line that could never be undone, and the connection we had shared would always linger in the shadows. But it was over now, and we both had to live with the choices we had made. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a soft, golden glow, I held Emily a little tighter, knowing that I had to find a way to live with the consequences of my actions. Because some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed.